and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Sonora Jha. Sonora, thank you so much for joining us via Zoom during this difficult time that we hope is coming to an end very quickly.
Thank you so much for having me, Nancy. This is such a pleasure.
Well, it's great to have you, and we're here to talk about your new book, which is How to Raise a Feminist Son, Motherhood, Masculinity, and the Making of My Family. And you grew up in India. This is a question I was thinking about on my last walk. You grew up in India, and what did you think your life was going to be vis-a-vis feminism, vis-a-vis your role in the larger world?
First of all, it makes me really happy that you were thinking of me on your walk. How precious the walks are. So, I was, I didn't think of the word feminism, of course. A lot of us come to that much later. But I know that as a girl growing up, there was some sense of injustice or difference or a sense of restlessness about the condition I was in or other women around me. And even though my family was really progressive in so many ways, my father was very progressive, my mother, and were very modern, and my father was in the Indian Army, my mother worked outside the home. These were all really progressive, modern things. And we lived in the city of Mumbai. But there were all these little things like, the privileges that were given to my brother, the way he was put in charge of me and was my disciplinarian, and just a host of inequities, and that I didn't even know was called the patriarchy, and, all of those things. But the sense of injustice, and I was kind of tapping into that. And I really was drawn to writing and to journalism because I felt I could tell these kinds of stories, but not necessarily about me. And I started to write those things. So there was this sense of wanting to change something, and then coming to understanding this feeling that I have is called feminism. I was introduced to it by a professor of mine, Jarumullah. But, really tapping into that feminist consciousness in my writing, in my journalism, in the kind of stories I pursued. So that gave me comfort, and that gave me a sense of purpose, and it gave me a voice, to express myself. So, there were all the joys of writing and the joys of being in India, and I loved being there. There's so many feminists there, but there was also the discontent, and I think I was growing up with both those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you grew up in a particularly interesting society where men are really using a verb that you use often in your book, centered. It's a male-centered, where women are not listed. You give voice to, I think it's your grandmother's name in the book, because she's not named in what the family Bible, or however one would keep a list of that. Do you think that had made it even more imperative for you, both at the time and looking back on it?
Yes. Again, it wasn't a conscious...
Right, of course.
But it also recognizing later that this was a Brahmin family that I grew up in, right? My father was a Brahmin. And even though we were not being raised religious, but these are social structures, right? You may say the equivalent of that here is, oh, I'm not a racist, right? But you are benefiting from racist systems. And so it's the same thing. In the Brahmin society, you're the oppressor, and you have been for generations. And what does it mean to be a Brahmin male, and to then my father being in the army, and all these very masculine systems that were around us, even though my family was trying to resist them and walk away from them, but was really shaped by them. And so the thing that you're referring to is this this list or this genealogy of Brahmins that is recorded, and the men are listed, but really in that family tree, the women are not listed, and so that's why in the book I feel like, let me write my grandmother's name. And I wanted to, I don't name my mother, and but I would wish that women in my family were also listed. So I and my sister, who's 7 years younger than me, now have these conversations, and as adult women started to realize, like, wait, this is wrong. This is, so that kind of understanding, or that kind of consciousness that connected, it fell into place with reading, with experiences, with talking to other women, with seeing what other feminists were doing, and then thinking back and memory, saying, oh gosh, yes, that made sense with what was happening as I was growing up, So yeah, that's the kind of system that I grew up in. And I see parallels here in the US, right? And I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but such parallels of different ways in which men are centered here, right? We talk about how white men are centered here.
Right.
And being able to see the parallels and make those connections, it feels to me like, no, I'm not done expressing myself.
Right.
So much more to do.
Well, I think that your background gives an added depth to the whole issue that you're talking about, because you're bringing to it not only your experiences here in the U.S., but also the system that you grew up under. And I thought that was one of the very interesting things about your book, was that dual way, I think, of looking at feminism, or what we now call feminism, but the role of men and the role of women.
Right. Yes.
So you said that you had a professor who really gave you, introduced you to the idea of feminism, or gave that feeling a word, a name. Was that was in India as well, or was that when you went to, okay, because I know then you went to Louisiana, LSU.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this was in India, and her name is Jaru Mullah. She was the one who told me that the term feminism, I heard it from her. I remember the moment in which she said it, and I was just wide-eyed. She was a feminist herself, and she directed me to read Simone De Beauvoir and Germaine Greer, and the books of those times that were ahead of our, when I was reading it. But so we would, because we spoke in English and we read mostly in the English language, that was what we embraced. And then I started to read feminism in, other writers like Ismat Chugtai in India and Mahashweta Devi, and read their stories or see televised stories, shows. And see that, these women have been talking about feminism for a very long time, right? Mm-hmm. So that kind of consciousness that I started to develop by reading and seeing my experiences reflected. And then, of course, when I came to the US, there was other readings, and it's just continued. And then I'm a scholar. Now I'm a feminist scholar. I'm a feminist media scholar. So there's, reading it all the time.
Living it all the time, too. Maybe we should have begun here, so maybe we should take a step backwards. Will you talk about, will you define feminism for us?
Oh my goodness. I would define it as a recognition of the systems that have women live unequal lives, and to lean into that, and women and non-binary people, and just people who are, it's about gender, right? It's gender exploitation or gender inequities. And so a feminist, while we tend to think of feminists and we think of women, feminism is really that idea. It's sort of like Gloria Steinem has said it best, the radical idea that women are people, right? So that women have agency, that women have choice, and that women should be the drivers of their own destiny. And to recognize that we are not there at that point, that there are structures that need to be dismantled. So really anyone that believes that, and believes that women should have, should be people, is a feminist.
And you make a distinction. You talk about bad feminists in your book. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Right. So bad feminists are the ones that give in, and I'm on some days a bad feminist, and Roxane Gay has written a whole book on it. But, it's where when we realize that there are certain systems that are causing these inequities, but we continue to uphold that system, right? That I would wear makeup, and so some feminists may think, oh, that's bad feminism, you should just embrace the way you are, and but I enjoy some of that, so I explain that in that regard, right? That I have agency, but also there's a recognition that, well, maybe this is part of the way I've been taught to look at myself, and if I looked at myself differently, it may be more freeing, right? Or criticizing some other women, like a friend of mine and I were talking the other day about the Meghan Markle interview, and we had to really catch ourselves in the way we were talking about different women in that story, and the whole competition between the two princess, the duchesses, and all of that. We tend to fall into some of those ways of talking about women, that the ways that patriarchy has taught us, and we talk about the notion that patriarchy really employs women as its foot soldiers. We are doing that work of patriarchy when we do that kind of thing. So it's that constant sense of like making that mistake and then recognizing it, catching yourself, forgiving yourself, because come on, I mean, how would you overcome, centuries of conditioning? And but recognizing that. And so, on some days, yeah, I'm a bad feminist. Like I write in the book about how with my son, while my son was growing up, I was always on a diet. I was talking about, oh my goodness, I'm so fat, I shouldn't eat this. What were those messages I was giving to him? That women around you should be constantly worried about how they look,
Right.
That's bad feminism.
Yeah.
Your book is divided into chapter. It's such an interesting combination of a memoir and a how-to. I love the way it's balanced among all those different types. So I feel like I said before we began this that I feel like I know your son so well. The first thing I asked you was whether he graduated from Swarthmore and what he's doing, because you get a real sense of him as a young child and then watch him grow up. So what were some of the steps that you took to, I mean, you as a individual, individually, we can't make global changes, but individually we can help change one person at a time, right? I mean, isn't that, and so what are the steps what are some of the steps that you used to to make your son aware of the inequities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that I don't know if I was thinking of it in terms of steps, but and that's what I invite other parents or family members, educators, aunts, uncles, everyone that has influence on a boy, to just kind of, it's just kind of like making like a check in your brain, right? That, oh, I'm going to raise someone to be a feminist, have feminist values, make that a value system in my family. And because that was a central desire, and I write in the book about why I was afraid when I found out that I was having a boy. I was afraid of the kind of man he would be. And so it was important to me that he have feminist values. Now, I didn't use the word feminism around him, but the things I was doing were, once you have that sense of like, this is a feminist value that I want to bring in the upbringing, then you start to see through that lens. And I think, so that's the first step, to constantly have a feminist lens, to have the language, to get the language and the lenses, and do little things, right? Like twist around the nursery rhyme. And that was so much fun to do, even though I was ruining those lovely nursery rhymes, but, and twist around the fairy tales. And so those are the earliest stories that we are telling our boys. And we have to, look for stories where girls were powerful and were at the center of the story and had agency. And it was not about finding the prince. And, so little things like that And then, I write about going to the movies and saying things like, oh, why was this character, shown in this light? And then he started to do that, and he started to push me as well to, see more feminist films and think more of feminism. And then also kind of be watchful when there are friends, and, not to interfere necessarily, but to recast, right? To recast some of the conversations. Then also, the toxic masculinity of certain men around us, the men we love, we can't help but love them and have them in our lives, but we can constantly recast messaging, that they may be giving our boys. That if they're talking about women in a certain way, we can say, I didn't like when he said that. So maybe we shouldn't talk that way. It just made me a little sad, and I don't think of women that way. And, and I overheard my boy once having a conversation with a friend of his saying, I don't like to use that kind of language for girls, and that was in middle school. It just made me so happy, I wanted to go hug him, but that would have embarrassed him, so I didn't. So little things like that, that we're constantly checking in, teaching boys to apologize. I realized that was such an important thing. And I realized so much later, with an interaction with my son, where he said, no, your brother needs to apologize to you. And I, realized how that is something that actually is a very conscious thing, that let them fail, right? Let boys fail, because that part of the toxic masculinity is that we don't let men fail, and we tell them failure is terrible. And so they do terrible things in order not to fail, right? Like maybe say that an election was not fair, right? Because they cannot deal with that kind of failure. But so teaching them to deal with failure, to embrace it, to say, okay, you can be weak, you can be a follower, you don't always have to be a leader, let women lead, get out of it.
You don't have to be good at sports, you don't have to be successful.
Exactly. You can fall, you can cry, right? All those little things that, yes, add up as steps, but it's like in that package of values and a feminist lens and feminist language. And I think especially, tendering a genuine apology and saying, I messed up, I'm going to do better now. So we equip our boys that way. I think it just makes a whole lot of difference.
I was really interested that in the chapter, I think, on fairy tales and the chapter on books and reading, of course, I was very interested in that, when you talk about Gail Levine, I think it's Gail Levine, right? Her retellings of classic fairy tales that do that kind of twisting that you talked about to put to give the girl agency, I think is what we would say. But I was especially interested when you mentioned that Tagore, the great Muslim poet, a Pakistani poet, I guess, right? No, not Muslim.
Yeah, he's not Muslim. He was Hindu. I don't know how much he embraced Hinduism, but he was Hindu and from India.
But how his stories are really, talk about that. Talk about Tagore.
Yeah, and I shouldn't say the word out loud because I've named my dog Tagore after that. So he may think I'm calling him, but because we're so, and he ended up being one of my son's favorite poets and philosophers, and so and he's a Nobel laureate poet, and his stories, like the one of Charulata, is about a lonely housewife and her being attracted to her brother-in-law, and other stories about there's a story called Ghare Baire. I think it's Inside, Outside, or The Home and the World. The Home and the World is what it's translated into, and these were made into films by Satyajit Ray. And, these were men that were telling these stories about the women's minds and their inner worlds and their desires, and centering those as important stories to consider. And these were beautiful stories. I don't, of course, read Bengali, but, I read English translations, and those were just gorgeous stories. So we have a tradition of that in India. And I wanted to pass that on, and my son discovered more and more of that writing, and sort of, brought that back into my world. I'd heard of those growing up.
Right.
This is a beautiful story. And to have him see those stories written about Indian women by Indian writers was just such a gift.
And we should say that Tagore lived in the early 20th century. We're not talking about the 21st century Bengali writer. Yeah. When you do your own reading for pleasure, when you're just sort of kicking back and doing some reading, what do you read?
Well, I like to read poetry. I like to read, like right now, the kicking back part of it. I'm reading Samantha Irby's Wow, No, Thank You. It's just such a funny, her voice is incredibly funny and just so lovely to read, laugh out loud funny. I liked her first book as well, We're Not Meeting in Real Life, so I like things like that. I do like things that are really compelling, like Megha Majumdar's book, A Burning. And I'm also listening to, as I walk my dog, I listen to books, and just like you do. And I'm listening to Raven Leilani's book, Luster.
Uh-huh.
Just, books that people have recommended. Then the fallback books, right? Just listening to Virginia Woolf again. And Sarah Ahmed on feminism, the Living a Feminist Life. I can go through one chapter and just feel immediately like a reset button, especially when I'm feeling maybe not that feminist or, thinking about, I feel like I just need to lean into someone's writing. I would listen to that. Audre Lorde, so, to me, that's kicking back as well in a way, right? Like having someone say, hey, it's okay, kind of a thing. And then also the humor. I love humor. I love first-person books as well. Just first-person narratives. I'm working on another novel that's written entirely in a male voice. So unfortunately, I've been listening to a lot of male voices as well talk about centered stories. But it's going to be written differently. So
In that novel that you're working on with a male as the main character, is he going to be sympathetic?
Yes, and I had to really struggle with that because I'm writing a story about the white male gaze, and it's difficult, and it's probably going to be a difficult book to sell because I'm a woman of color writing from a different perspective, and the people have had no problem publishing white men writing from the point of view of people of color and women, but I know that appropriating a voice of a white male, he's an English professor. I think that's going to be, I know that I've succeeded at it because readers have said that nailed it because, that voice is so deeply ingrained in our heads. Right. But we'll see whether it gets published because it's a difficult thing to pull off in terms of the point that I'm making. So yes, he's a sympathetic character, but at the same time, a very problematic sympathetic character.
Mm-hmm.
Are there male writers whose work that you admire? Contemporary male writers?
Yeah, for sure. I do like Rabindranath Tagore. What are contemporary male writers whom I like? I'm going to have to think. K.C. Lemon, his personal essays, Alexander Chee's personal essays, that I really, really love. They're writing about so many things that are important to me. I really appreciate that. Who else? I should be able to think of more male writers.
You'll stay away from Updike, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. I have to read him in order to write this other character in my book. But I felt like I should cover the book with brown paper. But if I'm sitting in a coffee shop, like why? The rest of the world is reading women of color now, and here I am going back to reading,
Right.
men.
Right.
So
yes.
I did enjoy Julian Barnes's book, A Sense of an Ending. I read that.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked that, and some of the. What was that book about these killings in Ireland recently? A couple of years ago, was it nominated for a Booker or? I'm just blanking on the name. I really enjoyed listening to it, even though it's just such a brutal book.
It's not the Patrick Radden Keefe, the nonfiction. The book you're talking about was a novel.
It's a novel.
Yeah. Right.
A fictionalized account of some killings and I get drawn to the dark stuff.
Yeah.
Concrete as well. Oh gosh, I'm just again blanking on this book. I'm totally blanking on my.
Yeah, don't worry. That's fine. I will never play any quick recall game again. One more quick question. Do you get a lot of pushback from your students? You're a professor at Seattle University and you teach what you live, which is very nice, I'm assuming. But do you get a lot of pushback from young male students, especially, or female students? I shouldn't have asked it that way, I guess.
No, that's fine. I did, so I started teaching in 2003. And I remember I used to ask my class, I was teaching a class on media studies, media literacy. And I would say, okay, who here identifies as a feminist? And just about 2 or 3 hands in about a 30 people class would go up. And I would then talk about feminism, and then I would get some pushback, and it would be from very unexpected sources. Women who I thought that you are living a feminist life, you are embodying feminism, and women of color even. And so I don't know what that was. I mean, I think it was because feminism and the identity of feminist was so reviled, especially in the U.S. It wasn't that much in India. That it took me by surprise coming from India and seeing that this place that had so much of feminist thought come out that was formative to me even, that young women here especially were not identifying as feminists, and certainly no young man's hand would go up, and now, of course, across gender, so many people, it would be rare. I feel like I don't even have to ask that question. So there's very little pushback that I get now. Now, having said that, there are unconscious biases at play, and often women of color, especially in academia, get dinged on their teaching evaluations, and especially those people of color and women of color who teach about social justice issues, right? If you're talking about race and you're talking about feminism, you'll get something on your evaluations every now and then that shows up, and it's never direct. It's not like, I don't like the color of her skin. It'll be things that are indirect, right? She's disorganized, or things like that just feel like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Or she's arrogant. You'll get things like that, which they wouldn't say necessarily about a man. And so many studies have been done about this. But there's a rising consciousness among students, and a lot of them want to embrace this. But it's not done yet. I did get one thing about, could we not make everything a feministic argument, or something like that? And I smiled at it and I said, no, too bad. Everything is about feminism.
I think that's a great place to end. That's a wonderful ending. This has been an interview on Book Lust with Sonora Jha. And Sonora, thank you so much for enlivening this half an hour for us.
Thank you so much for having me, Nancy. This is great.
Bye-bye.